Welcome back to the Classical Liberal Arts Academy's Petty School Reading Program. In this lesson, we'll continue our study of language and reading in the classical tradition. Let's go ahead and get started. In our last lesson, we learned how Latin sounds changed over time. First, we learned about the sounds used by the Old Romans, called Classical Latin. We also learned the 7 changes made in Church Latin. What are the 7 basic changes of Church Latin? The 7 changes of Church Latin are: the diphthongs I and oi are read as e. Ke and ge are soft with e and e, as che, chi, je, and g. Ge and n together sound as enye. And before vowels, at the start of words, the vowel e becomes j, and u becomes ve. We also learned that any time we need to read Latin, we must ask whether we should read it with classical or church pronunciation. And we learned a rule to help us answer that question. If the author of whatever we're reading was an old Roman, then we would read with classical pronunciation. For everything else, we use church. In this lesson, we are simply going to practice reading classical and church Latin. The best way to master Latin pronunciation is by practice, and I'm going to help you read through 2 fables from Old Rome and 2 prayers from the church, and in them we'll practice reading classical and church Latin. Here we're going to read together the story of the crow and the fox. Remember, this fable was written by an old Roman named Phaedrus. Since it was written by an old Roman, we're going to read it with classical Latin. Let's read it together. Cum corvus vellet commesse casseum raptum de fenestra residens celsa arbore vulpes invidit deinde sic coepit loqui. O corve, qui nitor est tuarum pinnarum, quantum de coris geris corpore et vultu, si haberes vocem, nulla alles foret prior, at ille dum vult ostendere vocem, etiam emissit caseum lato ore. That may have been difficult, but remember, you simply need to read the classical Latin one syllable at a time. Have your mother or father help you and go back and review this reading. You can listen to it and follow along as many times as you need to until you can read it all by yourself. Go ahead and practice, and make sure you use classical Latin. Remember that in this lesson, we're reading the fables of Phaedrus just to practice reading Latin correctly. You simply need to look at the syllables and read them with the right sounds. Of course you don't know what the Latin means yet. You've never studied grammar. You're only in petty school. You'll understand it one day, but now just practice making the right sounds when you read the Latin. Let's have some fun, though, and read this fable in English. And then I'll ask you a few questions that you can talk about with your parents. Listen to the fable of the crow and the fox. One day, when a crow wished to eat a cheese stolen from a window and sitting high in a tree, a fox was jealous, and so he began to speak. "Oh, crow, how shiny are your wings! What beauty you have in your body and face! If you have a voice, none of the birds will be greater than you." And the crow, when he wished to show off his voice as well, dropped the cheese from his mouth. The fable of the crow and the fox. Here are some questions that you can discuss with your parents. Why did the crow sit high in a tree? Another question is, what did the fox want? The third question is, how did the fox get what he wanted? And the last question is, how can you watch out for foxes like this in your life? In the fable of the crow and the fox, we practiced reading with classical Latin. Now, let's practice some church Latin. We're going to read the Ave Maria, or the Hail Mary. Let's read it together in Latin, and remember the 7 changes of church Latin. If you don't remember them, stop here and go back and review. If you do remember them, let's go ahead and read the prayer together, one syllable at a time. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Jesu. Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostre. Amen. Did you make sure that you read it with church pronunciation? You can listen to this slide again and make sure that you pronounce every syllable perfectly. Remember that in this lesson, we're only worried about reading the Latin syllables correctly. Here, we're going to read another fable by Phaedrus, and remember, he was an old Roman. That means we should read his fable with classical pronunciation. Let's go ahead and read The Pig and the Wolf. Premente partu scrofa cum gemeret iacens. Accurrit lupus et obstetricis partibus se posse fungi dixit. Promittens opem. Quae vero nosset pectoris fraudem improbi. Suspectum officium repudiavit. Malefici et satis est. Inquit si recedis longius. Remember, your job is simply to read the Latin syllables correctly. Of course, you don't know what these words mean yet. You haven't studied grammar. In the next slide, we'll read this fable in English and discuss some questions, just like we did before. Let's read the fable of the pig and the wolf together in English. After the reading, we'll discuss 3 questions about the fable. Listen to the pig and the wolf. With birth coming, a mama pig groaned while lying down. A wolf came to her and said he could do the work of a midwife, offering help. She, who knew the trickery in his wicked mind, rejected the evildoer's suspicious deed and said, "It is enough for me if you move further away." The fable of the pig and the wolf. Here are some questions to discuss with your parents about this fable. First, do you think the wolf wanted to help the mama pig? Second, what did the mama pig think the wolf would do? And third, how can you watch out for wolves like this in your life? Our last reading in this lesson will be the Lord's Prayer, or the Pater Noster. The Lord's Prayer was not written by an old Roman, and therefore we know that it should be read with church Latin. So let's go ahead together and read the Lord's Prayer in Latin, one syllable at a time, just like you've learned. But remember, there are 7 changes in church Latin. If you don't remember them, you need to review. If you do remember them, let's go ahead and read together. Pater Noster, qui es in celis, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut in cielo et in terra. Panem nostrum quotidianum da nobis hodie, et dimitte nobis debita nostra, sicut et nos dimittimus debitoribus nostris, et ne nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. When we read the 2 Latin prayers in this lesson, we read them very slowly. If you were to pray them that slowly, you would sound silly. So I'm going to read them at a normal speed so that you can hear what they would sound like, and you can practice reading them a little bit faster as you get more comfortable with church Latin. Listen carefully and practice listening to this slide over and over as many times as you'd like. Listen to the Hail Mary. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesu. Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen. That was the Hail Mary read at a normal speed. Go ahead and practice it. Now I'm going to read to you the Lord's Prayer in Latin at normal speed. If you want to go slowly, you can use the slide that we studied earlier in this lesson. But if you want to learn to say it more quickly, the way it would normally be said, you can use this slide to practice with your speed. Listen carefully to the Lord's Prayer in Latin. Pater Noster, qui es in celis, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut in cielo et in terra. Panem nostrum quotidianum da nobis hodie, et dimitte nobis debita nostra, sicut et nos dimittimus debitoribus nostris. Et ne nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. That was the Lord's Prayer at normal speed. In this lesson, we have simply practiced reading classical and church Latin. We've read 2 fables by the old Roman Phaedrus and 2 very popular Christian prayers, the Hail Mary and the Lord's Prayer. Remember that the question we should always ask any time that we would need to read something in Latin is, should we use classical or church pronunciation? Our rule is that if the author was an old Roman like Phaedrus, then we would use classical pronunciation. And for everything else, we use church pronunciation. And lastly, remember, reading classical Latin is very, very simple. Every letter has only one sound. We've studied that through this entire course so far. But when we come to church Latin, there are 7 basic changes of church Latin. The diphthongs I and oi are read as e. Ke and ge are soft with e and e, as che, chi, je, and g. Ge and n together sound as enye. And before vowels, at the start of words, the vowel e becomes j, and u becomes ve. These are the 7 changes of church Latin. We hope you've enjoyed this lesson in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy's Petty School reading program. We'll continue our study of language and reading in our next lesson. God bless.